Welcome, fellow learners. Today, we're taking a really deep dive into a systematic theology text. We're exploring the fundamental nature of the Creator, specifically looking at this concept that God is, well, inherently self-glorious. Now, this isn't just a sort of feel-good discussion about how wonderful God is, not at all. We're actually trying to investigate the very geometry of existence, if you like, tracing this thread of divine perfection right from eternity down to the existential reason why the universe even holds together and why our happiness seems tied to worship.
That's right. And the source material we're looking at today, it provides a really comprehensive and I'd say challenging framework. It's trying to define the stability of the universe itself, the necessity of worship, the very nature of divine justice, and ultimately the endpoint, the purpose for every single creature. We're digging for that profound structural why behind everything. And it's all rooted in this idea of God's complete self-sufficiency. So if you've ever felt a bit overwhelmed trying to connect these, big theological definitions of God with just your daily life, this deep dive is really designed to try and bridge that gap.
Okay, so let's try and unpack this. It sounds like a monumental concept. Our mission today, for you listening, is to get a fundamental understanding of why God's glory is independent and immutable. What does it mean that he doesn't rely on anything he created? And what does that frankly startling fact mean for us? Beings who live entirely within time and space. We're starting way up here, analyzing an infinite eternal being, and then we're going to work our way down to see how that perfection actually dictates the mechanics of our temporary, contingent lives.
All right, so inherent glory. When most people think about divine glory, I imagine they picture, angels singing, people praising, almost like that praise is fuel for God. But the source material we're using, it seems to immediately redefine that. It focuses on inherent glory. So what's the fundamental difference here between inherent glory and, let's say, acquired glory, as the text presents it?
Yeah, that's a great starting point. It's really the difference between, say, a power source that sustains itself versus something that needs external input, like plugging something into the wall. The core concept here is self-existence, complete self-sufficiency. God's glory isn't an attribute that can be, topped up or diminished in any way. The source is very direct about this. It points to passages like 1 Timothy 1.12.
Ah, the King of Ages.
Exactly, where God is called the King of Ages, immortal, invisible, the only one who is inherently God. This glory is intrinsic. It's part of the divine essence itself.
Okay, so first things first, we need to establish that this self-sufficiency, this inherent glory, applies right across the Godhead.
Absolutely. The source is really insistent on this. Both the first person, who we often call the Father, and the second person, the Son. They are both inherently glorious. They possess this glory completely in and of themselves. It's this glory that makes them God, sets them infinitely apart from every creature, doesn't matter if it's a human or the highest angel. And that leads us straight into this concept of immutability.
Immutability, meaning it can't change, regardless of anything external. That seems absolutely critical, doesn't it, for the structural integrity of the whole cosmos?
It's the bedrock. It really is. The source stresses that God's glory is eternal, infinite, and eternally unchanging. It draws on passages like John 17.5.
Where Jesus speaks about the glory he had with the Father before the world existed.
Precisely. Before time, before space. If that glory could change, well, then the ultimate standard for everything, justice, truth, reality itself, it would fluctuate. That would be chaos. But because his glory is immutable, unchanging, it's perfectly full. It doesn't matter whether time and space exist or not. It's a complete, perfect state of being that exists entirely outside the dimension of change.
I find that analogy sometimes helpful, the idea of a perfect sealed container of light that's always full. But let's push on that a bit. If this container is always at maximum capacity, always full, how does this idea of independence from creation actually play out? Why does the source insist so strongly that God is not glorified by creatures in a way that actually adds anything to him?
Well, think about it. If our worship, our praise, actually added something to God's glory,
then it would imply he was missing something before, that he wasn't complete.
Exactly. It would imply he was somehow deficient before he created anything, or that his state of being could somehow be improved by us. And if that were true, then the existence of creation itself would be fulfilling some kind of divine need, which would make creation necessary for God. And that completely violates the principle of self-sufficiency we just talked about.
Right. So the source argues creation exists not to complete God,
but because God's perfect, overflowing fullness chooses to express itself outwardly, it's an act of sovereign will, not need.
And that really is the central paradox of creation, isn't it? We're commanded to worship a God who needs absolutely nothing from us.
Precisely. And the text notes this. It says the level of worship offered by creatures might change over time. Creatures start imperfect, they grow, they become complete. So the experience of glory, how creatures perceive it, that can change. But God's essential glory, that remains absolutely constant, always full. Our worship, you see, it's functional for us. It's not for him, not in the sense of adding anything. We are, in a way, serving ourselves by choosing the path that aligns us with the ultimate source of life. We're not fulfilling some lack in the Almighty.
Okay, so to really hammer home this transcendence, this otherness, the source focuses heavily on that description you mentioned earlier, God as the King of Ages, from 1 Timothy 6, right? The one who alone possesses immortality, dwelling in inaccessible light.
Yes, 1 Timothy 6, 1, 4, and 5, 16. And that phrase, inaccessible light, is profoundly important. You really need to grasp this. It signifies that the first person's glory, his essence, is so intense, so absolute, so inherently not creaturely, that no created entity, none, can approach it directly or even bear the full vision of his substance. This is the ultimate declaration of, ontological difference, a difference in being itself. He's not just more powerful than us, he's fundamentally different from everything else that exists. Only God inherently possesses immortality, life without beginning or end. Every creature, us included, angels too, we only possess life contingently, meaning we only have it because he actively, constantly sustains it.
Okay, that sets the stage perfectly for this next topic, which is, frankly, mind-bending. The difference between the creator, who is necessary, who must exist, who always exists, and creation, which is utterly contingent, dependent.
Right. And this is where we really have to step outside our usual way of thinking, maybe outside of standard physics even, and into the realm of eternal theology. God always exists. He cannot cease to be. It's his nature. And he is the sustainer of everything else, including time and space itself. The text explicitly says that time and space exist within him. It's not like the universe is the box God lives in. No, God contains the entire reality, everything temporal, everything spatial within his own eternal being.
So if God is necessary, the sources make this terrifying counterpoint about everything else, don't they? This idea of the contingency of creation.
Yes, and this is a difficult concept for us to really internalize because we are entirely dependent on existing. We take it for granted. But the source states very clearly, all creatures, angels, humans, all life, even concepts like death, time itself, space itself, they are all contingent, meaning if God were simply to withdraw his active will, his power that sustains them.
They would just revert to non-existence.
Exactly. They would revert to non-existence. The original source uses a specific term, aion, which translates essentially to non-being. We're not self-existent beings. We are merely sustained moment by moment.
Wait a minute, let that sink in. If the King of Ages sustains everything by the word of his power, that means the structure of time itself, the planets orbiting, the angels flying, even the very concept of death. These are all conditional constructs. They constantly require active divine input just to avoid collapsing back into nothingness.
That is precisely the implication, yes. It elevates God's sustaining power beyond just, keeping things ticking over.
Yeah.
It's constant active creation or perhaps recreation, moment by moment. Think about the sheer vastness of the cosmos. The implication is staggering. Every single moment, every single particle is held in place, held in existence by the direct, active will of the self-existent one.
Wow, okay. And this leads to what the outline calls the deep, almost incomprehensible mystery of non-existence. If creation is contingent, the source emphasizes that this non-existence is still somehow always within God. What does that even mean?
It's tough, isn't it? As creatures, we are completely tethered to time and space. We can't actually conceive of non-existence. Our entire experience is bounded by being, by duration, by existing in time. But God, the text argues, is the God of both existence and non-existence. It suggests that God views existence and non-existence not as sort of two separate boxes outside of him, one empty and one full, but rather as possibilities or conditions that are held within his eternal will. For us, non-existence is this terrifying, unthinkable void. But for God, it's simply the state of being that he has currently chosen not to actively sustain for certain things, or could choose not to sustain for anything other than himself. Let's push on that philosophical implication a bit. If non-existence is within God, does that suggest that non-being is like a constant state that God actively holds back, almost like a programmer holding the potential for code that isn't running right now? It suggests something even more radical than that, I think. It means the only thing that absolutely cannot return to non-being is God himself.
Mm-hmm.
God's own essence, everything else. Ultimately, it's a choice of divine will whether it exists or not. And this absolute difference, this infinite gap between the self-existing king dwelling in that inaccessible light and the creature that can simply be returned to non-being, that is the central problem. That's what makes revelation absolutely necessary. If the gap is this vast, how can communication, how can relationship even possibly begin. #2, Revelation and the bridging of the creator-creature gap.
Right. So if the first person, the Father, dwells in this inaccessible light and he's pure spirit, and creatures literally cannot bear his substance, how does any creature, even the most exalted angel in heaven, truly see God at all?
And that brings us neatly to section 2.1 in our outline, the inherent limits of creaturely perception. The first person's glory, as Hebrews 1.3 notes, is the exact imprint of his nature. It is his nature. But because he is spirit, he is fundamentally invisible and unapproachable to creatures in his unveiled essence. So when he is revealed in Scripture, in prophetic visions, think of Ezekiel's vision by the river Chebar, or John's vision in Revelation chapter 4. The description has to use analogies we can grasp.
Yeah, we see the throne described with earthly things, don't we? Jasper, a ruby, a rainbow around it, a figure on the throne that looks like a man seated on something like sapphire. Why the need for all these analogies?
It's the very nature of divine revelation for creatures. We simply cannot handle the raw fullness of his glory. The source explicitly mentions Daniel chapter 10, verse 7. Remember that. Even a glimpse of a powerful angelic being, let alone God, caused Daniel's companions to flee in terror, and Daniel himself collapsed. So this self-limitation by God, using analogies, it's essential, it's necessary. Now, humans often perceive this limitation as God hiding himself. Isaiah 45.5 talks about the Deus absconditus, the hidden God. But the text we're examining argues it's actually an act of profound mercy. God is limiting the overwhelming reality so that we, the creatures, don't just perish on the spot. God reveals himself only to the exact extent he allows us to see and understand. No more, no less. It's perfectly calibrated.
Okay, so even though he's limiting the vision of his glory, he's not limiting the power, right? The power that holds everything together. That sustaining power must be constant, mustn't it?
Right. Exactly right. Hebrews 1.3 affirms that he sustains all things by the word of his power. That power doesn't fluctuate. The word, the second person, is the creator, the active force maintaining the entire structure of time and space, even while the fullness of the first person's glory remains hidden, veiled out of mercy. So the system, the universe, it remains structurally sound because the underlying power is unlimited, even if the visual experience of that power source is severely curtailed for our protection, for our benefit. #2.2, the self-emptying of the second person.
So given that the first person is inherently unapproachable, invisible in his essence, there has to be a way to bridge this infinite ontological gap, right? And the source points directly to the absolute necessity of the incarnation, the kenosis, the self-emptying of the second person.
This is it. This is the definitive answer in this theological framework to that huge creature-creator gap problem. The second person, the Son, is originally just as invisible, just as glorious, equal in glory to the first person. We established that earlier with John 17.5, that shared glory from before creation even began. Yet this second person willingly, voluntarily self-empties. And the crucial point the source makes here is that kenosis is not an emptying of his divinity. It's not like he stopped being God. That's impossible. He's a mutable God. Rather, it's an emptying, a setting aside of the divine status, the prerogatives, the visible manifestation of the glory that he held as equal to the Father.
He takes on the form of a creature, a human being, so that creatures like us can finally see God in a form we can relate to, a king we can touch and hear and follow.
Precisely. The incarnation, the word becoming flesh, as John 1.14 puts it. That's the moment the invisible glory became visible glory. It's the only way, according to this text, for creatures to perceive the divine essence without being utterly, incinerated by that inaccessible light. It's the manifestation of God that a contingent, fragile creature can actually handle. And here's the remarkable tension, the paradox. He is still sustaining the entire universe by the word of his power, even while he's walking around as a human carpenter's son in first-century Judea.
That dynamic tension, the sustainer of the cosmos living in this humble human form, it's almost impossible to really get our heads around. The sources give us a specific example, don't they? A glimpse of this limited yet powerful revelation, the Transfiguration, Luke chapter 9.
Ah, yes, the Transfiguration. It's a critical theological flashpoint in the narrative. Think of it as a temporary, controlled burst of the underlying glory. Jesus' appearance literally transformed. His clothes became dazzlingly white. The text uses language suggesting a light not of this world. It's a visual representation of that uncreated, inaccessible light filtering through his adopted creaturely form. And significantly, who appears with him? Moses and Elijah.
Representing the law and the prophets, history itself.
Exactly. And they're discussing his imminent death in Jerusalem. This suggests his death wasn't an accident, but the central axis upon which all of history turns, fulfilling everything that came before it.
The source notes this was a temporary vision, right? A glimpse of the Son's glory shown through the Holy Spirit. A preview of the kingdom of the Son before his suffering. Why did it have to be temporary, and why was Peter immediately, well, sort of shut down when he wanted to build tents?
It had to be temporary because the disciples, Peter, James, and John, they were still mortal. They weren't yet resurrected beings themselves. They simply couldn't endure the full, sustained reality of the kingdom glory yet. And Peter's reaction, bless him, was impulsive, wanting to build 3 tents, one for Jesus, one for Moses, one for Elijah. It was a very human, creaturely attempt to sort of localize the glory, contain the moment. And crucially, it put the Son on the same level as Moses and Elijah, representatives, however great, but still creatures. That's why the voice from the cloud corrects him immediately. This is my Son, my chosen one, listen to him. The vision then ceases, confirming that the ultimate authority rests solely and supremely with the Son. It was a glimpse, but a vital one, intended to confirm his divine identity before he faced the ultimate self-emptying on the cross.
And this sets the stage perfectly for the post-resurrection reality, the resurrected king. The text describes the resurrected Son who came first as Adam, a human, but then became like an angel through resurrection, meaning incorruptible, no longer subject to decay. He is the one now seated on the throne, holding the keys of death and Hades. Revelation 1:18.
Yes, he's no longer just the earthly Adam. He is the God-man, resurrected, glorified, having conquered the very boundaries of the temporal realm, death itself. He inherited the keys, the authority over death and Hades, through the successful completion of his mission, the kenosis culminating in resurrection. And the source stresses, he is still the creator who holds the entire universe together by the word of his power. He's doing that right now, even in his glorified, resurrected body. The sustaining act never stopped.
That imagery in Revelation, his face like the sun shining in full strength, it brings us right back to that inaccessible light of the Father, doesn't it? But now it's mediated, seen through the Son, who creatures can now behold in his glorified form.
Exactly. It's the glory made accessible through the mediator. And the source goes even further. It promises that after the Son finishes his work of saving those he intends to save, he will ultimately take death and Hades themselves, these concepts, these realms, and incinerate them in the lake of fire, bringing them to a state of non-existence. His authority is absolute. It covers not only life and space, but the realms of death and ultimate non-being as well. He truly is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end of all things contingent.
Okay, so now we arrive at maybe the central question for us as creatures. The why. Why are we even here? If God is totally self-sufficient, lacks absolutely nothing, why bother with creation at all? Why are we here?
This is the great paradox, isn't it? And it's what the source material really aims to resolve. The answer it gives is this. Worship is fundamentally, primarily, a gift to the creature, not a gift to the creator. We absolutely must start with the premise that God does not need our service or worship. He's not lacking anything. The source quotes Acts 17, Paul at the Areopagus. God is not served by human hands as if he needed anything, because he himself gives all men life and breath and everything else.
Well, because God is completely full, completely perfect, the reason we worship cannot possibly be to fill some void in him. If we approach worship thinking, I'm doing God a favor here, we've completely missed the entire point of divine self-sufficiency.
Completely missed it. The source states it clearly, forcefully even. God created creatures in such a way that they are happiest, most fulfilled when they worship him. Worship isn't designed as a chore for us to give something to God. It's designed as the absolute mechanism by which creatures receive life. The text uses the specific word, damyong, directly from God. And it's this influx of divine life received through worship that then enables them to start loving others genuinely. It's the energy source, if you will.
Okay, so worship functions like an internal pipeline, or maybe like plugging into the divine power grid. We connect to God through worship. We receive the life and love that flows eternally from his self-sufficient glory. And only then, once we've received it, do we actually possess the capacity, the spiritual energy to truly love our neighbor.
That's the structure of creaturely existence, according to this source, yes. The necessity of love, the command to love, is rooted entirely in this divine plumbing, this flow. Creatures must receive God's life and love first to even begin loving others authentically. Think about it. If you, as a contingent being, inherently lacking, try to love without first receiving life from the Almighty, you're inevitably going to fail. Why? Because you're trying to give something you don't inherently possess in yourself. You end up trying to fulfill your own lack through the relationship. That's the definition of selfishness, not love. Only the Almighty, who has no lack, who is perfectly self-existent, can give love without needing anything in return, without depletion.
Wow, that completely reframes the command to love your neighbor. It's not just, an ethical rule dropped from the sky. It sounds more like a fundamental law of spiritual existence, a law that can only actually be obeyed if the creature is actively drawing life from the source through worship.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The source suggests that trying to love without worship is like trying to run a massive factory without connecting it to the power plant. It's just unsustainable.
Yeah.
It's doomed to failure because the creature is inherently finite, inherently deficient on its own. Happiness, therefore, isn't just a nice byproduct of doing good works. Happiness is the state of existence achieved when the creature is properly aligned with its creator, actively functioning as a receiver of divine life.
Okay, this structure makes the choice facing every creature incredibly stark then, really clear. It sounds like there are only two fundamental paths: existence for God or existence for self.
That's how the source presents it. Two paths. Path 1, existence for God. The process is straightforward. Worship God, receive life from God, and then, empowered by that life, love the neighbor. That's the intended design for eternal happiness and fulfillment. Path 2, existence for self. What happens here? The creature refuses worship. They try to fill their own inherent lack by their own efforts, and the source is unflinching, quite stark here. This inevitably leads to trampling the neighbor. Why? Because if you're not receiving life from God, you try to steal it, or steal the feeling of life, steal satisfaction from others. You try to build yourself up by pushing others down, and this inherently, fundamentally violates the core command of love.
And when that command of love is violated, when the creature chooses self-existence and starts trampling others, that's when divine justice is activated. The source says God is just and will use the term incinerate those who trample others.
Yes, that's the role of judgment, often symbolized by the imagery of the lake of fire. Justice, divine justice, demands that the penalty for the sin must be commensurate with the sin itself. And this includes considering the infinite value of the lawgiver God himself who was offended by the sin. So the punishment has to be proportional. The text uses a challenging comparison to make this point. It argues, look, the penalty for a creature who commits an offense against, say, 1,000 other beings, or worse, against the Creator who sustains hundreds of billions of beings, that penalty cannot possibly be the same as the penalty for someone who committed a much smaller offense. The source insists, for example, that the ultimate punishment fitting for Satan cannot be the same as the punishment fitting for Cain. God's justice is precise, it's proportional, and it's absolutely required to uphold the moral integrity of the universe he created.
Okay, this brings us to probably the most nuanced, maybe the most challenging theological concept in this entire discussion, what the outline calls the paradoxical love of judgment, particularly concerning the lake of fire.
Yes, and this point really requires careful articulation. It's easy to misunderstand. For those creatures who, through persistent choice, find the very act of worshiping God, the source of life and love, to be a source of profound pain. Those who perpetually choose self-existence, which the text describes as a state of constant, agonizing struggle to steal life from others, finding no lasting satisfaction, just perpetual lack. For those beings, the source argues, eternal conscious suffering is not perpetuated endlessly by God.
Okay, wait, so instead of endless torment, God's judgment, the lake of fire, is actually described here as an act of profound love,
How?
because it leads to their ultimate non-existence. The source used that term, ijal kontaxis sam yaldo il aposediun geocida, annihilation, basically, after the penalty is paid.
Precisely. The suffering ceases once the debt incurred by the sin committed against the infinitely valuable Creator and against the neighbor has been paid through destruction. The logic presented is this. Since the existence of the creature is fundamentally contingent, remember they can return to non-being, and since the Creator, in his omniscience, knows that for certain beings, continued existence outside the worship mechanism is nothing but perpetual, self-inflicted, unending torment, then the most merciful act, after justice has been fully satisfied proportionally, is to allow them to return to non-being, to cease to exist. God refuses, in this view, to prolong the misery of those who utterly reject the only source of true life and love. It elevates justice beyond mere retribution or worse, eternal sadism. It anchors justice instead in divine love for the creature's ultimate well-being, even if that well-being ultimately means the cessation of their being, release from a state they fundamentally despise.
Wow, okay, so this completely reframes the popular concept of hell. It's not endless torture inflicted by an angry God, but rather the final, merciful conclusion of a proportional legal penalty. It allows the contingent being, which chose against life, to return to the non-existence it effectively thought through its refusal of the source of life.
That's the argument presented. It is the ultimate boundary drawn by divine love. God will not tolerate the trampling of others. Justice demands recompense. But equally, he will not force a creature to exist perpetually in a state of self-imposed agony that it fundamentally rejects. Justice serves to satisfy the requirement for proportionality, and the cessation of existence serves the creature's ultimate release from a misery it refused to escape through God's provided means. Hashtag 3.3, the authority of command and sacrifice.
This necessity of love and the corresponding necessity of justice when love is rejected leads us directly into the authority behind the command itself. God decided to rule time and space through love and command. Why is the preeminence of the ruler, God's own value, so critical to the authority of his law?
Because the importance, the weight, the unshakable nature of any law depends entirely on the importance, the value of the one who gives the law. Think about it in human terms. A rule set by a temporary committee doesn't carry the same weight as a fundamental constitutional principle. If God were merely very powerful but not supremely, infinitely precious and valuable in himself, then his commands could, theoretically, be superseded or maybe even negotiated. But the source is very clear, quoting Psalm 83.12. God alone is the most high over all the earth. Since nothing in existence is more precious, more valuable than God himself, his fundamental the command of love cannot be revoked. It cannot be lessened. It is absolute. Trampling the neighbor is utterly intolerable because it's a direct assault on the very structural design of reality, established by the ultimate, infinitely valuable authority in the universe.
And this leads us to the ultimate confirmation, the ultimate model that proves the inviolable nature of this command of love, the sacrifice of the Creator himself.
Yes, and this is such a radical twist on all creaturely expectations and hierarchies. Ordinarily, in any system of value, it is considered natural, even right, for the less precious thing to be sacrificed for the sake of the more precious thing. If your house is burning down, you save your child, not the sofa. You sacrifice the lesser for the greater. That's the natural law of value we all operate by.
But God completely flips that model on its head, doesn't he? The Creator, the single most precious, infinitely valuable entity in existence, sacrifices himself to enable creatures the least precious entities, in a sense, beings who are contingent and can return to non-being to actually love each other.
It's the definitive, unbreakable seal on the law of love. The source contrasts this divine action starkly with, say, human indifference. Humans often don't really care if lesser creatures like ants or bacteria kill each other. It's largely irrelevant to our core existence, right? But the Most High God cares profoundly, infinitely, when his contingent creatures trample one another. And by sacrificing himself, the ultimate act of love and value affirmation, the Creator confirms the absolute, non-negotiable value he places on that command. Trampling the neighbor cannot be tolerated. The self-emptying, the suffering, the death of the Son, which remember Jesus himself referred to as the moment he would be glorified in John 12:23, that act seals the eternal nature of the command. It guarantees that the structure built on love cannot ultimately be undone or overruled. So this act of self-sacrifice by the most precious being for the sake of the least precious, it solidifies the rule of love eternally. It makes it crystal clear that God's design isn't just arbitrary. It's not just a rule he made up. It's consecrated, validated, by his own ultimate act of giving. It demonstrates the sheer depth of God's desire for creaturely happiness, for relationship, for interconnectedness based on love. He doesn't just command it, he embodies it. He accepts the quote-unquote cheap worship of contingent creatures like us, and then he goes infinitely further. He sacrifices the most precious thing possible himself for our well-being so that we can participate in that love. This isn't driven by necessity on his part. It is sovereign, overflowing love, pouring out from a place of absolute fullness, absolute lacklessness.
Okay, let's step back again now and look at the whole grand scope, returning to God's nature, specifically his sovereignty over time. We, as temporal beings, being stuck in time, we struggle profoundly with this idea of a creator who isn't constrained by duration, by sequence.
Yes, section 4.1, transcending time. God is eternal. He's constantly existing, but he is not constrained by time as we experience it. We really have to stop thinking of eternity as just linear time stretching out infinitely forwards and backwards. That's our limited perspective. The source suggests God exists simultaneously in all moments, past, present, and future, because he is the author of time itself. Time exists within him, remember?
That concept is just intrinsically difficult for us, isn't it? Angels, humans, we exist entirely within these temporal bounds. If I move from moment A to moment B, experiencing duration, God is already fully present in moment A, fully present in moment B, and fully present in the duration between them, all at once.
That seems to be the implication. The source acknowledges that creatures existing only in time cannot fully grasp this.
Yeah.
How could we? But this transcendence of time is absolutely vital for his immutability, his unchanging nature. Because he is outside or perhaps above time, his glory is never diminished by the flow of moments. It's unaffected by the temporary failures or sins that happen within creation's timeline. It's untouched by the slow, often painful progress of redemption unfolding in those moments. He is fully present, fully glorious, fully himself in all moments simultaneously.
And the text calls him the Lord of Continuance, citing Psalm 104.5. He actively upholds the very structure of time and space.
Yes, he upholds it. And this includes all creation within that structure: life, death, angels, space itself. Everything is sustained by him. Psalm 96.5 is another reference point. He doesn't just manage time like a clockmaker. Time itself is in him. It flows from him. This distinction is crucial because it confirms his absolute sovereignty. Any failure, any rebellion, any sin that happens in creation is ultimately temporary relative to his eternal, unchanging self-sufficiency. And this absolute sovereignty also guarantees that the law of love, established by this eternal king, will ultimately triumph over the temporary rebellion that occurs in time. His purpose will prevail because he stands outside and above the timeline where the conflict occurs. Hashtag 4.2 worship in the heavenly realm.
Okay, so if the purpose of the creature is to receive life and find happiness through worship, let's look at how this perfect, self-sufficient God is worshipped. Where do we see the ideal? The source points heavily to the descriptions of ceaseless worship in the heavenly realm, particularly in Revelation chapters 4 and 5.
Right. This is presented as the operational model of heaven. It's a picture of continuous, joyful, reality-affirming worship. You have the four living creatures, these powerful angelic beings, constantly saying, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come." That's Revelation 4.8. It's ceaseless. And then you have the 24 elders, often seen as representing the redeemed people of God from all ages, continuously falling down, casting their crowns, giving glory, honor, and thanks to the one seated on the throne, that's the first person, and to the Lamb, the second person. Revelation 4.01, and then chapter 5, verses 11 through 14.
And the text notes the foundation of their worship, doesn't it? It's explicitly acknowledging their contingency. They give glory, honor, and thanks because the Creator made all things, and it was according to His will that they exist and were created.
Yes. Their worship is the perfect alignment of the creature with the Creator. They understand and joyfully acknowledge that their very existence, their being, flows directly from Him, and their happiness, their fulfillment, is realized in acknowledging that source. It's not a burden, it's liberation. Now, what's really crucial here, connecting back to our earlier discussion about the Son's self-emptying and subsequent glorification, is the unified adoration described.
Unified adoration, meaning the second person, the Lamb, the one who was slain, who took on creaturely form, he receives the exact same worship, glory, honor, and power as the first person, the one eternally seated on the throne.
Exactly the same. Listen to Revelation 5.13. To him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb be blessing and honor and glory and power forever and ever. This absolutely confirms their co-equal divinity, their shared immutable glory. Despite the unbelievable fact that the Son voluntarily became a creature, humbled himself, suffered, and died, the very structure of heavenly worship ensures there's no competition, no hierarchy of worthiness within the Godhead. All worship, all glory is directed absolutely and eternally toward the one perfect self-sufficient source of all things, which is the triune God. The Son's role as the resurrected King, the Lamb upon the throne, doesn't diminish the Father's glory in any way. It actually confirms it, because His work perfectly completes the Father's purpose for creation and redemption. Hashtag 4.3, the final unsearchable depth. So we started with God's absolute self-sufficiency, and it feels like we have to conclude there as well, recognizing the profound, maybe even humbling limits of our creaturely understanding. The source uses that powerful summation from Romans 11.36, doesn't it? Yes, it does. It's the ultimate statement about the source and end of all things. For from Him and through Him and to Him are all things. This establishes God unequivocally as the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning, the sustainer, and the final end or purpose of all contingency, everything that isn't God Himself. And this truth is what absolutely guarantees that no creaturely act, no matter how pious, no matter how sacrificial, can ever constitute a genuine gift or a loan to God.
Let's use that bank analogy you mentioned earlier, but push it further. You can't loan money to the bank that literally created the currency, but the source goes even deeper, right? Citing Romans 11.35, who was ever given to God that God should repay them.
Exactly. God isn't just the owner of the bank. He's the one who created the very concept of currency, the capacity for value, the ground of existence itself. and he created the capacity within the creature to even perform acts like worship or service. Therefore, any creaturely act, worship, service, sacrifice, love, it ultimately originates from the raw material, the potential, the ability that was first provided by God. So any attempt by us to repay God or somehow increase his glory is fundamentally futile. It misunderstands the basic relationship. And this absolute sufficiency is what guarantees structurally that worship remains solely for the creature's benefit. It's the way we receive, not the way he gains.
And finally, the text circles back to acknowledge the ultimate boundary of our knowledge, the unfathomable wisdom of God.
Romans 11.33 provides that profound, almost awestruck conclusion. Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and how undiscoverable his paths. God's wisdom, his knowledge, his plans, they are simply too deep, too vast for us to measure or fully comprehend. As creatures, we can only know what God, in his mercy and wisdom, permits us to perceive. Even our ability to speak about him is limited by the very language and concepts he himself gave us.
That really keeps this entire deep discussion grounded in humility, doesn't it? We've talked about incredible things on existence, the incarnation of the sustainer of the cosmos, eternal unchanging glory. But we have to remember we're discussing these things based only on what God has allowed us to see. It's like looking at an infinite king, but only through a very carefully calibrated, maybe even smoked lens designed for our protection.
That's a good way to put it. We must recognize that the infinite God sustains the infinite reality, and we exist only in this finite, contingent sliver of it. The sheer grandeur is beyond our comprehension, and perhaps that's why the source emphasizes again and again that God reveals himself only to the exact extent needed. Needed for what? Needed for creatures to understand enough to choose the path of life, to connect to the source through worship, and to receive the resulting happiness and capacity for love. Anything more the text implies wouldn't be helpful. It would simply be destruction for the creature.
#tag outro.
Okay. Wow. Here's where it gets really interesting pulling it all together. We've taken this deep dive, and what we seem to have discovered is that God's glory is this perfect closed loop. It's self-sufficient, eternally unchanging, complete in itself. But the creation loop, our loop, is entirely different. It's all about relationship, about revelation, and about the active flow of life from that perfect self-sufficient source. Exactly. And I think the greatest implication from all this, for you the learner, for all of us, is that the motivation for living a good life, for choosing love over trampling, for performing worship, it's fundamentally self-serving, but self-serving in the most positive, intended, designed sense. It's not selfish, it's simply acknowledging reality. Worship is the only pathway established by the Creator for us to receive the necessary life and happiness. And it's that received life that then enables true love towards others. So to stop worshiping, in this view, isn't really robbing God of anything he needs. It's simply cutting yourself off from the only source of power that sustains creaturely virtue, happiness, and ultimately existence itself.
So what does this all boil down to? The ultimate purpose of creation wasn't, and never could be, to somehow increase God's glory. That's impossible. The purpose seems to be to allow contingent creatures like us to participate in the life and the love that flows eternally from his self-sufficient glory, making us fully complete, truly happy, and genuinely capable of loving each other, mirroring, in our finite way, the love within the Godhead.
And that brings us right back to that most challenging, perhaps provocative insight we discussed regarding the nature of justice. If God's ultimate judgment, symbolized by the lake of fire, is actually rooted in his love, because it ultimately refuses to prolong the perpetual self-inflicted misery of those who irrevocably reject life and love. If it culminates in their return to non-existence after justice is proportionally paid, what is that unique concept, that cessation of suffering through cessation of being? Tell us about the ultimate depth and purpose of divine justice itself. It's a provocative thought, perhaps, for you to explore further on your own. Is it possible that true, eternal justice, precisely because it flows from perfect love and perfect knowledge, must also be, in its final analysis, profoundly merciful, even when it involves destruction?